Walter Boone had been fixing motorcycles for 38 years, and he'd never once seen a wreck that scared him. Until he sanded down the tank of a bike nobody claimed, and found a name underneath the paint. A name he recognized. A name he was never meant to know. He should have stopped. He should have called someone. Instead, he stayed up until 3 in the morning and made it beautiful again. 11 days later, a line of Harleys blocked both ends of his street, and Walter walked out into the daylight understanding something with total clarity. This had never been about a motorcycle, and somebody had been watching him the entire time. Before we go back to that garage, before you meet Walter Boone, and the men who came for him, and the man who sold a dying rider's motorcycle for scrap, I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments. Just the town? Just the state? Ohio, Texas, Carolina, wherever you are. Because this story happened on a road that most of America forgot about. A 2-lane strip of asphalt that used to matter and doesn't anymore. And I'd bet money there's a road like it where you live. And a shop on it. And an old man inside who does honest work for people who can't always pay him. So tell me where you are, and while you're down there, comment, "I'm here for Walter," because there's a man in this story who tried to bury him, and that man is counting on people like you and me scrolling past. Hit subscribe if you'd rather not give him the satisfaction. There's a road in Ashland Ridge, Ohio that used to be somebody's shortcut. Trucks came through it, salesmen came through it, kids came through it on Friday nights with the windows down and nowhere in particular to be. Then the state put a bypass in about 4 miles east, and the road stopped being a shortcut, and after that it stopped being much of anything at all. Now it's just a strip of cracked asphalt, with weeds coming up through the seams, and a handful of buildings that never quite got around to closing. One of them is a 2-bay garage with a hand-painted sign out front that says Boone's, nothing else. No phone number, no hours, just the name, in white letters that were repainted about 6 years ago and are already starting to gray at the edges. The man inside is named Walter Boone. He is 61 years old. He has been fixing motorcycles in that building since he was 23, which means that when he opens the bay door in the morning, he is opening a door he has opened somewhere north of 10,000 times. He does not rush. That's the first thing anybody notices about him. Walter Boone moves through a job the way water moves through a canyon. Slowly, completely, and with absolutely no interest in your opinion about how long it's taking. He is not fast. He has never been fast. He is also not cheap, though not for the reason you'd think. He's not cheap because he won't put a part on a bike that he wouldn't put on his own, and the parts he'd put on his own cost money. What he is good. Not good the way a brochure means it. Good the way a thing is good, when a man has done it for 38 years and never once found a shortcut he was willing to take. That kind of good is going extinct in this country, and Walter Boone knows it, and it does not seem to bother him one way or the other. He just keeps opening the door. He lives alone above the shop. His wife's name was Dolores. She died 4 years ago, in the spring, and Walter has never talked about it publicly, and never will. And there is no version of this story where anybody makes him. But if you walked into that garage today, you would find, sitting on the counter next to the register, a pair of women's reading glasses, wireframes, one arm slightly bent from being sat on, a long time ago, by somebody who thought it was funnier than her husband did. They have not moved in 4 years. Walter works around them. And here is the thing that nobody in Ashland Ridge knew. Not his neighbors, not his customers, not the woman who ran the diner 2 doors down and brought him coffee he never asked for. Walter Boone was 91 days from losing all of it. He was $14,000 behind on the building. The bank had sent the letters. The letters had gotten more polite, and then less polite, and then had stopped being letters at all, and started being notices. And Walter Boone, a man who had never missed a payment on anything in his life until his wife got sick, had put every single one of them in the same drawer, unopened after the first, and had not told one living soul, not one. To understand why a man like that would do what he was about to do, you have to go back a long way. Further back than the bank, further back than Dolores, all the way back to a boy in that same building, standing on an upturned crate because he wasn't tall enough yet to see over the bench. Walter Boone's father was a mechanic. His name was Harley, and he opened that shop in 1961. And by every account, he was a hard man in the way that men of that generation were allowed to be hard. Quiet, particular, and generous in ways he would have been embarrassed to have pointed out to him. Harley Boone did not teach his son to work on motorcycles the way you'd teach a class. There was no curriculum. There was just the shop, and the long afternoons, and a boy handing his father wrenches he didn't yet know the names of. But there was one lesson, and Walter has repeated it, word for word, to every person who has ever asked him about his father, for 50 years. He was 11 or 12. A man had brought in a bike, an old one, a wreck, something that by any reasonable measure was not worth the labor. And young Walter, who was at the age where a boy first discovers he is capable of an opinion, said something to the effect of, "Why are we bothering? It's junk. It's not worth what he's paying." And his father did not look up. He did not raise his voice. He just kept working, and after a while he said, "You don't fix a machine, Walt. You fix whatever it was carrying." That was it. That was the whole lesson. Harlan Boone never explained it, never expanded on it, never brought it up again. He just said it once, into an engine block, and went back to work. And his son spent the next 5 decades finding out what it meant. Because here's what Walter came to understand. Slowly, over 38 years and a few thousand machines, a motorcycle is never just a motorcycle. It's a man's first taste of not being afraid. It's the thing a widower rides on Sunday because the house is too quiet. It's the last thing somebody's father ever touched. People do not come to a shop like Boone's because they need transportation. They have cars. They come because something they love has stopped working, and they cannot bear it. Walter Boone did not fix machines. He never had. Now there was a rule in that garage. One rule. Not a suggestion, not a preference. A rule. The kind of rule a careful man builds his whole life around. And Walter had held to it for 38 years without a single exception. Never work on a bike you can't trace. Never touch a machine when you don't know where it came from, who owned it, and how it got to your door. Because in that business, on that kind of road, a bike with no history is a bike with a reason for having no history. Harlan Boone taught his son that too, though he said it with fewer words and considerably more profanity. 38 years, not once. Walter Boone was 11 days away from breaking that rule, and he was going to break it on purpose. It was a Tuesday, in October, and it was raining the way it rains in Ohio in October. Not hard, just steadily, like it had decided to keep at it until somebody stopped it. Walter Boone was awake. He'd been awake since 2. He was not sleeping much in those days, and if you have ever been 91 days from losing the only thing your father left you, you already understand why. He heard the truck before he saw it. Air brakes, out on the road, at a time of night when there is no traffic on that road at all. And then the sound of a flatbed backing up a gravel lot that had not seen a flatbed in a very long time. Walter went down in his work pants and a jacket over his undershirt, and he came out the side door of the shop into the rain, and there was a man standing at the winch with the chains already coming loose. He wasn't a big man. He was young. He had a hood up, and he did not turn around when Walter said something to him. And he did not turn around when Walter said it a second time. Walter asked for a name. The man didn't give one. Walter said there was paperwork. There is always paperwork. That is not optional. That is not something a shop does as a favor. And he went inside and came back out with a clipboard, and the man would not take it, would not sign, would not look at it. He unhooked the last chain. He walked back to the cab, and then he stopped, with his hand on the door, and he said the only complete sentence he said that entire night. Somebody said you were the last honest man on this road. Then he got in the truck and pulled out, and the taillights went up the hill and around the bend, and Walter Boone was alone in a gravel lot in the rain with a motorcycle that had come from nowhere. It was a 1998 Softail, or it had been. The forks were bent backward, not bent, folded, the way a paperclip folds, which told Walter everything he needed to know about the speed, because forks do not do that below 70. The tank was cracked along the left side and pushed in like something had knelt on it. The exhaust was gone. The primary was gone. Half of what should have been on that bike was still somewhere on a road, in pieces, in the dark. And on the seat, on the leather, soaked deep in, and dried down to a brown so dark it read as black in the yard light, was a stain in the shape of a man's back. Walter Boone stood in the rain and looked at that seat for a long time. Then he went inside and picked up the phone. Because his first instinct was the right one. It was the correct one. A wrecked bike, no papers, no name, dropped at 4 in the morning by a man who wouldn't sign for it. A wrecked bike with a rider's blood still on it. That is a police matter. That is not a gray area. Any sensible man in America picks up that phone. Walter dialed 6 of the 7 numbers, and then he stopped, and he set the receiver back down in the cradle. And why he did that, is the only question in this entire story that actually matters. Before we go any further, you should know something. Walter Boone was 3 months from losing everything he had ever built, and not one person in a suit ever lost a single night of sleep over it. Not one. And there are people watching this right now who know exactly what that feels like. If you believe a man who spends his whole life fixing what other people broke deserves better than a foreclosure notice, hit subscribe. The men who sent that notice never would. And comment one word: honest, because that's what they called him. Let's see how many of you still believe that word means something. He started that same night. He never went back to bed. Night 1 was the frame. You cannot do anything with a wrecked motorcycle until the frame is true. And a frame that has been folded at speed does not come back easily, and it does not come back cheap. Boone's garage had a straightening jig that Harlan Boone bought used in 1974, and that Walter had rebuilt twice with his own hands. He fired it up at 4:30 in the morning with the rain still coming down on the roof, and he hung that Softail in it, and he worked until the sun came up, and then he worked past that. His equipment, his electricity, his hands. There was no invoice. There was nobody to send one to. Night 2, he pulled the tank and the wiring and laid it all out on the bench, every piece of it, in the order it came off, because that's how his father did it, and because a man who is not sleeping needs a system more than a man who is. Night 3 is the one you need to hear. There was a part he could not source, a component on that bike that had not been made in years and could not be fabricated and could not be substituted, and Walter found one, a good one, the right one, from a private collector 3 states away, and the man wanted $1,100 for it and would not move a dollar off that number. Walter Boone did not have $1,100. Walter Boone did not have $110. So on the morning of the 4th day, he drove into Mansfield, and he went into a pawn shop on 4th Street, and he took off the counter a small ring that had belonged to his wife. He sold Dolores Boone's wedding ring for $900. He covered the rest out of the register. He did not tell anyone. He drove back. He put the part on the bench, and he went to work. Night 5. Night 6. The neighbors started to notice. By night 7, the woman who ran the diner 2 doors down told her husband that the light in the back of Boone's was on at 3 in the morning again, and that it had been on at 3 in the morning for a week, and that somebody ought to say something to Walter. Nobody did. That's a small town for you. Everybody sees it. Nobody says it. He wasn't sleeping. He was working, and then he was standing over the work, and then he was working again. Night 9. He sanded the tank. It was cracked on the left side, and to repair it he had to take it down. Down through the clear coat, down through the paint, down to bare metal. And Walter Boone sat on a bucket with a block in his hand and took a 1998 Harley-Davidson tank down layer by layer, the way you'd peel back years. And about 2/3 of the way through, under the primer, in hand lettering that had been painted over and buried and forgotten for a quarter of a century, something came up out of the metal, a name, and a date. The date was March of 1998. Walter Boone read it twice. Then he sat down on that overturned bucket in an empty garage at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he did not move for 11 minutes. It was 14 minutes past 7 in the morning, and Walter Boone was standing at the bench with a coffee he had not touched, and he heard it before he understood what he was hearing. Sound carries strangely on a road with nothing on it. There are no buildings tall enough to break it, and no traffic loud enough to bury it, and so a noise coming from 4 miles out arrives long before the thing making it does. And what arrived that morning, at first, was almost nothing, a pressure at the bottom of the ear, the kind of low hum you feel in your teeth before you feel it anywhere else. Then it became a sound. Then it became engines. 90 seconds. That's how long Walter Boone stood in the open bay door of his father's garage and listened to something coming that he could not see yet. 90 seconds is a very long time. Try it. Stand somewhere and listen to a thing get louder for a minute and a half and do not move. He knew what it was. Any man who has spent 38 years around motorcycles knows the difference between 1 bike and 2 bikes, and that. That was not 2. That was not 5. They came over the rise at the north end of the road, and they came in a formation that was not casual, and they did not slow down until they were on him. 17 motorcycles. They came into the lot, and they came onto the road on either side of it, and Walter watched them do something that told him more than anything else that morning would tell him. They took the north end of the street, and they took the south end of the street, and they stopped, and they sat there. They blocked it, both ends. Nobody was coming in. Nobody was going out. Then the engines went off, one at a time. over about 20 seconds, until the last one died, and the road went so quiet that Walter Boone could hear the sign over his own door moving in the wind. Nobody spoke. 17 men, and not one of them said a word, and not one of them got off, and they sat there in the cold, with their hands on their tanks and their eyes on him, and the only living thing on that entire road making any sound at all was the crow on the wire behind the shop, which after a while stopped as well. Then the man on the lead bike swung his leg over and stood up. His name is Halloran. He was in his mid-50s then. Big through the shoulders, silver coming into a beard he had not trimmed for anybody in about 20 years, and he wore the patch of the local charter with the word president on the front of it. And I want to be very careful about how I describe what happened next, because if you have never been in a moment like this, you will imagine it wrong. You'll imagine shouting. You'll imagine somebody grabbing somebody. There was none of that. Halloran walked the length of that garage, from the mouth of the lot to the open bay door, maybe 40 feet, and he did it slowly, and he did not once take his eyes off Walter Boone's face. And when he got there, he stopped about 4 feet away, and he said nothing. For a full minute, 60 seconds, count that out. A man who has come with 16 others, who has closed both ends of a public road, standing 4 feet from a 61-year-old widower in a shopcoat, saying absolutely nothing, while behind him, a wrecked and rebuilt Softail sits on a lift in the second bay, with fresh primer on the tank. Then Halloran said 4 words. Flat. No question mark in his voice at all. Where'd you get it? And Walter Boone told him the truth. He told him about the rain. He told him about the flatbed. He told him about the man who wouldn't give a name and wouldn't sign a clipboard, and said one sentence and drove away. He told him he never had papers because there never were papers. He told him he'd picked up the phone and then put it down. He told him all of it, straight through, and he did not add a single thing to make himself look better. Halloran listened, and then Halloran said, no. And that right there, was the most dangerous moment of Walter Boone's entire life, because he had nothing else. He had no receipt, no name, no license plate, no witness, nothing on the security camera, because there was no security camera, and there was not one single fact on God's earth that Walter Boone could produce to prove that he had not stolen that motorcycle. He said quietly, "It's the truth." And Halloran looked at him for a long moment, and then Halloran reached into his cut, and Walter Boone closed his eyes. Leave him there. Leave Walter Boone standing in the mouth of his father's garage with his eyes shut, and a man's hand inside a leather cut 4 feet from his chest, because there is something you have to know first, and if you don't know it, none of what happens next will mean anything at all. We have to go backward. 3 weeks. Different road, different night. Route 32, east of Columbus, is a good road in daylight and a bad one in the rain, and on a Thursday evening in late September, it was doing what that road does in September, throwing water up off the seams in long silver sheets, so that the reflectors stopped being reflectors and became a kind of smear. There was a man on that road doing 85 miles an hour. He should not have been. He knew he should not have been. He had ridden for 51 years, and he had never once in his life been the kind of man who rides like that. And if you had told anybody who knew him that he had been clocked at 85 in the rain on a Thursday night, they would have told you that you had the wrong man. His name was Elias Vance. Everybody called him Deacon. He was 68 years old. He had been one of the men who founded that charter, one of the originals, one of the names, the kind of man that other men lower their voices around, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect than most people ever get to feel in their whole lives. And he was going 85 miles an hour in the rain because there was a hospital in Columbus, and inside that hospital there was an operating room, and inside that operating room was his granddaughter. She was 7. The surgery had been moved up. They had called him at 4 in the afternoon and said, "Come now," and Deacon Vance had gotten on his motorcycle because that is the only way that man had ever traveled anywhere in 51 years, and he had put his head down and he had ridden. He never got there. They found him in the grass 140 feet from the road. They had to airlift him. His heart stopped once in the helicopter and once again in the building. And Elias Deacon Vance, 68 years old, founding member, legend, did not open his eyes again for 19 days. Now, here is the part that the club could not explain, and it ate at them for 3 weeks. The bike was gone. Not impounded, not at the state lot, Not in any tow yard the club could find. And understand, those men can find a motorcycle. That is not a difficult thing for them. They made calls. They went to every yard in 3 counties. They sent riders out to walk the shoulder of Route 32, looking for so much as a mirror. And there was nothing. A wrecked motorcycle does not simply cease to exist in the state of Ohio. And yet for 21 days, that is precisely what Deacon Vance's Softail had done. And nobody in that charter could tell you where it went. And every day that it stayed gone, the thing sat heavier on them, because of what that bike was. Which brings us back to a name in the paint. In March of 1998, Elias Vance's daughter was born. And in the weeks after, the way some men plant a tree, the way some men bury a bottle of wine, Deacon took the tank off a brand new Softail, and he laid it across a bench, and he hand-lettered his daughter's name onto the bare metal himself. Not a shop, not a painter, him, with his own hand, which was not a steady hand, which is why the letters leaned slightly to the right and always did. And then he painted over it. He buried it. Under primer, under color, under clear coat, so that nobody would ever see it, so that no one would ever ask him about it, so that for the rest of his life, he could ride a motorcycle that had his daughter's name on it, and be the only person alive who knew. That's the bike. That's what came off a flatbed at 4 in the morning in the rain, with a stranger's blood on the seat, and no papers and no name. That was never a machine. That was a father's love letter, written in 1998, sealed under 27 years of paint, and carried 100,000 miles by a man who never told a soul it was there, and a 61-year-old widower in Ashland Ridge, Ohio, a man who had never met Elias Vance, who did not know his name, who had no idea what he was looking at, had spent 11 nights and his wife's wedding ring bringing it back. You don't fix a machine, Walt. You fix whatever it was carrying. 50 years earlier, in that same building, on that same floor, a hard man had said 11 words to his son and never explained them. Walter Boone had just spent 11 nights obeying them. He just didn't know it yet. Now, a lot of people watching this already decided what kind of men rode into that parking lot. They decided it the second they saw the patch. And they've been deciding it for 60 years. From behind a newspaper, from behind a windshield, and these days, from behind a keyboard. If you're not one of those people, if you believe a man is what he does, not what he wears, comment. Judge the man, not the patch. And if you're the kind of person who'd still stop for a stranger on the side of the road, hit that like button, because I promise you, the people who wouldn't stop, they're not going to. Now, back to that hand, inside that cut. Halloran's hand came out of his cut, and there was nothing in it but paper. An envelope. Thick. Thick enough that it didn't fold when he held it. Thick enough that Walter Boone, standing there with his eyes shut, felt it pressed flat against his chest before he understood what was happening, and opened them. It was sealed. There was nothing written on the front of it. It had been carried in that man's inside pocket, against his ribs, for the entire ride from wherever they had come from, and it was still warm. Walter didn't take it. He just looked at it. Halloran said, "Open it." So Walter Boone, 61 years old, standing in the mouth of his father's garage on a closed road, with 16 men behind him, tore open an envelope with his thumb. It was money, cash, bound in bank straps, mixed denominations, the kind of stack that is not clean and is not new and has clearly been assembled rather than withdrawn. And Walter, who had spent his whole life around a register, who could count a drawer without looking at it, knew what he was holding almost before he had it all the way out. $14,000. Not 13, not 15, not a round number that a man might pull out of the air because it sounded generous. $14,000, exactly. And Walter Boone went cold. I want you to understand what happened to him in that second, because it was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was something much closer to terror, because that number was not a number that existed anywhere in the world outside of Walter Boone's head and the inside of a drawer full of unopened letters. He had not told the bank he couldn't pay it. He had not told his sister in Toledo who called him every Sunday. He had not told the woman at the diner. He had not told a customer, a neighbor, a friend, a priest, a bartender, or a single living human being on this earth. He had told nobody, and a man he had never met had just handed it to him in an envelope. Walter looked up, and he said, and his voice, by every account, did not sound like his own, "How do you know that number?" And Halloran said, "Because we've been standing outside your shop for 11 nights, Walter. Every single one. Here is the truth. They never lost that motorcycle. Not for 1 hour. Not for 1 minute. The Hells Angels of that charter knew exactly where Deacon Vance's Softail was from the moment it came off the highway, and they knew where it went, and they knew who put it there, and they had a man parked up on that rise at the north end of the road on the night the flatbed came in, sitting in the dark with the engine off, watching a garage light come on at 4 in the morning in the rain. He was there the next night, too. And the next. For 11 nights, there was a man on that hill. They watched Walter Boone straighten a frame with his own equipment on his own electricity. They watched the light burn at 3 a.m., and on the 4th morning, when Walter got in his truck and drove 60 miles to Mansfield and walked into a pawn shop on 4th Street and came out again, with his hands empty and his jaw set, there was somebody behind him. They knew about the ring before he'd finished driving home. They were testing him. And the reason they were testing him is the ugliest part of this entire story. For 3 weeks, that charter had been trying to find one man in the state of Ohio who would fix that motorcycle before Elias Vance opened his eyes. That was the whole of it. That was the entire objective. Get it done before he wakes up. Give him back the one thing he has left. 4 shops had it before Walter Boone did. 2 of them turned it down flat, wouldn't touch it, wouldn't say why, and everybody involved knew exactly why. And the other 2 did something worse. They took it in, they shook hands, they quoted a price, and then somebody in the back sanded the tank the same way Walter did, and found the same name Walter found, and figured out whose bike was sitting on their lift. And they did not call the family, they called each other. The first shop that motorcycle ever went to belonged to a man named Royce Kestler. Kestler owned 4 dealerships across that part of the state. He was in his own television commercials. He had a good haircut and a firm handshake, and the words, "Family owned since 1986, painted on the side of every building he owned. His people pulled Deacon Vance's Softail off Route 32 on a state contract on the night of the wreck, while Deacon was still in a helicopter. And when they got it back to the yard and got the paint off the tank and worked out whose it was, Royce Kestler did the math. A 1998 Softail, owned by a founding member of that charter, with his daughter's name hand-lettered under the paint in his own hand, is not a motorcycle. It is a collector's item. It is provenance. Royce Kestler put it up in parts. Frame, tank, motor, wheels, listed online, in pieces, with the photographs cropped so the name wouldn't show. $9,000 for the lot, cash preferred, no questions. Elias Vance was on a ventilator in Columbus with a tube down his throat and his daughter's name on the tank of a bike being carved up 2 counties away for $9,000. And Royce Kestler had done it because the man was in a coma. Because a man in a coma cannot call. And it would have worked. It would have worked completely. Except that Royce Kestler had a tow driver. 23 years old. Kid making $14 an hour. No benefits. Driving a wrecker on the night shift because he needed the money. And that kid had been the one who winched a dying man's motorcycle out of the grass on Route 32 in the rain. And that kid had seen the listing. And on a Tuesday night in October, that young man walked into a locked yard he had the keys to, put a wrecked Softail on the back of a flatbed that did not belong to him, and drove it 61 miles in the dark to a 2-bay garage on a road nobody used anymore. Because he had heard, from somewhere, that there was one honest man left on it. I want to spend some time on Royce Kestler. Not because he deserves it, because you need to understand exactly what kind of man he was, and exactly how ordinary he looked while he was being it. He was 54 years old. He owned 4 dealerships. He was on television, local television, the cheap kind, the kind that runs at 11 at night between the weather and a mattress ad, and he was in his own commercials, standing in front of a row of bikes with his arms crossed, saying the same closing line every time. At Kestler's, we treat you like family. Family owned, since 1986. It was painted on the side of every building he had. It was on the receipts. It was on the little air fresheners they hung on your mirror when you picked your bike up. He sponsored a little league team. He gave to the food bank at Christmas, and he made sure somebody took a photograph of him doing it. And here is what Royce Kestler actually did for money. He held the state recovery contract for a long stretch of highway. That is a good contract. That means when a motorcycle goes down, his trucks are the ones that come. His trucks are the ones that winch it out of the grass. His yard is the one it sits in. And when a bike came in off a serious wreck, the kind where they call the helicopter, Royce Kestler did not think about the man in the helicopter. He thought about the phone. Because a wrecked motorcycle, sitting in a yard belongs to somebody. There is an owner, there is an insurance company, there is a family, and eventually somebody calls. Somebody always calls and asks where it is and asks what it'll cost to get it back, and that is the moment the whole thing becomes complicated. Unless nobody calls. Unless the man who owns that motorcycle is in an intensive care unit with a tube down his throat. Unless he is unconscious, and his wife is sleeping in a plastic chair in a waiting room, and his kids are driving in from 3 states away, and not one single human being in that family is thinking about a motorcycle, because they are thinking about whether he is going to live. And that window, that gap, that terrible quiet week or two while a family sits in a hospital and does not think about anything else, that was Royce Kestler's business model. He would file the bike as unrecoverable, total loss, non-salvageable, disposed of, and then he would part it out. Frame, motor, tank, wheels, controls, exhaust, broken down and sold in pieces to buyers in 4 states. Cash, no paper, no title, nothing that ever had to be explained to anybody. And by the time the family surfaced, by the time somebody finally thought to ask where's Dad's bike, the answer was already on file, already stamped, already 3 weeks old. Total loss, disposed of, so sorry. And what were they going to do? Sue him? While their father was learning to walk again? 11 times. That is the number they could prove. 11 motorcycles over roughly 4 years, taken off the road on a state contract from Rex, where the rider went to the ICU. 5 of those riders never came home at all. Royce Kestler sold 5 dead men's motorcycles for parts while their families were picking out caskets. And then he went and got his picture taken handing a check to the food bank. He targeted men in comas, not because it was easy money, because it was safe money, because a man in a coma cannot make a phone call. That is the entire logic of it. That is the whole idea. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and you will not forget the name. Now the kid. His name was Ruben Ortiz. He was 23 years old. He drove a wrecker on the overnight shift for $14 an hour, no benefits, and he had been doing it for about a year and a half because his mother's rent was more than his mother's income, and that was simply the arithmetic of his life. He was the one who pulled Elias Vance out of the grass on Route 32. He was the one who stood in the rain on the shoulder of that highway and watched them load a 68-year-old man into a helicopter, and then went back and winched what was left of his motorcycle onto a flatbed and drove it back to the yard and logged it in, the way he had logged in about 400 others. And then, 3 weeks later, he saw it on a listing, in pieces, $9,000 for the lot, and Ruben Ortiz, who had no power, no lawyer, no savings, and nothing at all to gain from any of it, got in a truck that wasn't his, opened a gate he had the keys to, and stole a motorcycle back from his own boss. He was fired the next morning, and here is the part that tells you everything about Royce Kestler. He never called the police. He couldn't, because to report that motorcycle stolen, he would have had to explain what it was doing in his yard 3 weeks after he had officially certified, on a state form, that it had been destroyed. So instead, he did something quieter, and in some ways worse. He picked up the phone. He called every dealership, every shop, every yard, every garage he had a relationship with, in 3 counties, and Royce Kestler had a relationship with all of them, and he told them, one by one, that Ruben Ortiz was a thief. And that was that. 23 years old. No job, no references. Blacklisted across 3 counties for doing the only decent thing anybody in that whole chain of custody had done. He sat in his mother's apartment with nothing, and Ruben Ortiz was about to become the single most important person in this entire story. He just didn't know it yet. Let's be clear about what Royce Kestler was doing. He waited until a 68-year-old man was on a ventilator, and then he sold that man's motorcycle for scrap while his family sat in a waiting room. And he did it 11 times. If that makes you sick, comment, "No more vultures." Say it. Right now, in the comments, out loud. Because Kestler is counting on the exact same thing he has always counted on, that nobody says anything. And if you believe a 23-year-old kid who lost his job for doing the right thing deserves better than a blacklist, hit subscribe. Kestler wouldn't. Kestler's kind never do. Day 19. There is a particular quality to a hospital room on the 19th day. The flowers are gone. The visitors have thinned. The people who are still there are the ones who were always going to still be there, and they have stopped talking to each other, because there is nothing left to say that hasn't been said 11 times. Elias Vance's wife had been in that room, in a chair, for most of 19 days. There were men from the charter in the hallway around the clock. There had not been an hour in 19 days when there wasn't at least one of them sitting out there, and the nurses had long since given up saying anything about it. And on the 19th day, in the middle of the afternoon, with no warning at all, Deacon Vance opened his eyes. They got the tube out of him. It took time. He was weak in a way that a strong man is never prepared to be weak, and he could not lift his own hand, and he could not turn his head more than an inch or two. And his wife was leaning over him saying his name, and Halloran had come in from the hallway and was standing at the foot of the bed with his hands on the rail. And Elias Vance, 68 years old, 19 days gone, looked up at the ceiling and worked his mouth for a while, until something came out of it. It was not his wife's name. It was not his granddaughter's, and she had come through the surgery, and she was fine, and they had already told him so, and he had heard it. What he said was, "Where's my bike?" His wife started crying, not the good kind, and I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. A man wakes up from 19 days of nothing, and the first thing out of his mouth is about a motorcycle. And there is a version of you watching this right now that just thought a very hard thought about Elias Vance. Put it down, because here is what nobody in that room needed to be told. Deacon Vance's daughter was born in March of 1998, and Deacon Vance's daughter died in 2011. She was 13 years old. That is all the detail this story is going to give you, and it is all the detail you are owed, because it belongs to a family and not to us. She was 13. It happened. He buried her, and her father went out to the garage, at some point after that, and stood in front of a motorcycle with a tank he had painted over in 1998, a tank with her name under it, in his own crooked hand, from the week she came home from the hospital, and he never stripped it. He never showed it to anyone. He never told anyone it was there. For 14 years, he rode a motorcycle down every highway in Ohio, with his dead daughter's name sealed under the paint 6 inches from his hands, and he did not speak of it, and he did not need to, because he knew. That was not a bike. That was the last object on this earth with her name written on it in her father's handwriting. And on the 19th day, a man came up out of the dark and did not ask about his life, or his legs, or his own name. He asked where it was, because if it was gone, then she was gone twice, and he had been the one who did it. There is one more thing you need to know before this scene ends. 61 miles away, in a 2-bay garage on a road nobody used anymore, Walter Boone had spent 11 nights bringing that motorcycle back. He had straightened the frame, he had rebuilt the tank, he had sold his wife's wedding ring for a part, and he had cleaned that seat. He had conditioned the leather and worked it and brought it back, but there was a seam, down the left side, where the blood had gone in too deep to ever come out, and Walter Boone could have replaced that seat. He had the skill, he had the time. Nobody on this earth would have known. He left it. He left the seam exactly as it was, and when somebody finally asked him about it, years later, he said one sentence, and then would not discuss it again. Some things you don't scrub out. You just carry them. Back in that room, Deacon Vance was looking at Halloran, and Halloran said, "We got it. It's fixed. It's done." And Deacon said, and this took him a long time to get out, "Who fixed it?" And Halloran told him. He told him there was a man in Ashland Ridge. He told him about 11 nights. He told him about a pawn shop in Mansfield, and a woman's wedding ring, and a man who had never met Elias Vance in his life. And Elias Vance, who had not moved a limb in 19 days, who could not hold a cup of water, who had a machine breathing for him 4 hours earlier, started trying to get out of the bed. Go back to the garage. Go back to that morning, to a closed road and a sealed envelope, and to a 61-year-old man standing in a doorway, holding $14,000 in his 2 hands, asking a question he already knew there was no good answer to. Because there is a thing about that envelope that Walter Boone did not understand yet. He thought he did. He thought he had it worked out. 17 men, a club, a debt, a favor returned. That is a story that makes sense. That is a story a man can carry home and go to sleep on. It's wrong. That money did not come from the club. Halloran reached into his cut a second time, and Walter, and I want you to hold on to this, because I don't think a man ever fully recovers from a morning like that. Walter Boone flinched. Again. He couldn't help it. 11 nights of no sleep, and a road blocked at both ends, and a stack of cash in his hands that made no sense at all, and when that man's hand went back into that vest, Walter's whole body went stiff. What came out was a piece of notebook paper, folded into quarters. Soft at the creases, The way paper gets when it's been folded and unfolded a great many times, by a great many hands. Blue lines, torn edge at the top where it had come out of a spiral. Halloran held it out. Walter opened it. It was names. 147 of them. Written in 147 different hands. Some of them in pen, some in pencil, one or two in what looked like a paint marker. Some of them printed neat and square. Some of them so bad you could barely read them. A few were just first names. A few were just road names. One of them was a single letter and a number. 19 charters, independents, guys with no patch at all. Men from 3 states who had never met Walter Boone, who would never meet Walter Boone, who would not have recognized him if he walked past them at a gas pump. Because the word had gone out. That is what happens in that world, and most people on the outside have no idea. Word goes out. It does not go out on the news, and it does not go out on the internet. It goes out at a pump, at a bar, at a funeral, in a parking lot. There's a mechanic up in Ashland Ridge. Fixed Deacon's bike. Nobody asked him to. Nobody paid him. Sold his wife's ring to buy a part for it. Wife's dead. And 147 men, none of whom had anything to gain, none of whom would ever be thanked, none of whom were ever going to be named in a newspaper, passed a hat. 6 days. That's how long it took. $14,000, raised in 6 days, $20 and $50 and $100 at a time, by men who had been told by this country their entire lives that they were the ones you crossed the street to avoid. And here is the thing that neither of those men could ever explain, and that I am not going to try to explain to you either. $14,000 was what they raised. $14,000 was what Walter Boone owed the bank. Not approximately. Not close enough. Exactly. To the dollar. Nobody had known the number. Nobody had asked. They had simply stopped when the hat was full. Walter stood in that doorway and looked at that piece of paper for a long time. And then he asked Halloran how they got to that number, and Halloran told him the truth, which was that they didn't get to it. They just got there, and neither of them ever tried to make sense of it again. Not that day. Not in the 4 years since. Some men would call that a coincidence. I'd say it depends entirely on what kind of man you are, and I'd leave it there. Walter Boone did not say thank you. He couldn't. His mouth wasn't working right, and there was a piece of notebook paper shaking in his left hand. And he was 61 years old, and he had not cried in front of another human being since the spring of the year his wife died. What he finally said, quietly, mostly to himself, looking down at the floor of a garage his father built, was this. My old man used to say you don't fix a machine, you fix whatever it was carrying. And Halloran, president of that charter, a man who had blocked a public road at 7 in the morning, with 16 others behind him, stood there in the cold, and thought about that for a second. And then he said, yeah, well, same goes the other way, Walter. And for the first time in 44 minutes, everybody breathed. Now I know what some of you have been waiting for. You've been waiting since the words Royce Kestler came out of my mouth. You've been sitting there for 20 minutes with a very specific picture in your head, and that picture involves 17 motorcycles pulling into a dealership lot, and it involves a man in a good haircut coming out of a glass door and finding out what the rest of his life is going to look like. That is not what happened. That is not what happened, and I want to be extremely clear about it. Because Halloran was extremely clear about it. On the record. On tape. To a reporter. With his lawyer sitting next to him. We don't do that anymore. And we don't have to. He did it to himself. We just made sure people could see it. Here is what actually happened. The club went and found Ruben Ortiz, 23 years old, unemployed, blacklisted in 3 counties, sitting in his mother's apartment with a phone that had stopped ringing, wondering whether the single decent act of his adult life had been worth what it cost him. 2 men from that charter knocked on his door, and Ruben Ortiz let them in, and then he went into his bedroom, and he came back out with a folder. He had been documenting Royce Kestler for a year, not for anybody, not on anybody's orders. Nobody had asked him to, and nobody knew he was doing it. He had just started keeping things, photographs, time-stamped, from the yard, on his own phone. 11 motorcycles. He had shot each one when it came in, and he had shot the state form that said it had been destroyed, and then he had gone home and found the listing online and screenshotted that too. 11 bikes. 11 riders, 5 of them dead. He had the names, he had the dates, he had the crash reports, because a tow driver sees the crash reports. He had the disposal certifications with Kestler's signature on them, and he had the listings, the photographs cropped just tight enough that the tanks wouldn't show. He had built a case. A 23-year-old kid making $14 an hour had spent a year building an airtight fraud case against his own boss, and he had nowhere on God's earth to take it, because who exactly do you hand that to? The police in a county where Kestler sponsored the Little League team? A lawyer he couldn't afford? A newspaper that took his advertising money? He had it, and he had nobody, and so he sat on it. Until 17 motorcycles found out he existed. The club did not go to Royce Kestler. They went to a reporter at a mid-sized paper who had been trying to get somebody, anybody, on the record about that state recovery contract for 2 years. They went to the Ohio Department of Insurance, Fraud Division, and they went, and this is the part that matters, to the families. All 11 of them, personally. Riders drove to 11 houses in 3 states and knocked on 11 doors, and sat at 11 kitchen tables, and told 11 families what had actually happened to their husband's motorcycle, their father's motorcycle, their sons. 5 widows found out that year what Royce Kestler had sold while they were sitting in a hospital chapel. The record then, flat, as it happened. The story ran in March. The state opened a file in April. 2 of Kestler's own employees flipped in June. One of them a service manager who had been putting the listings up himself and had, it turned out, been keeping his own copies for exactly the same reason Reuben had. The insurance carriers pulled his bonding in August. The state contract was gone by September. 2 dealerships closed in November. The 3rd in January. The 4th was sold at auction, and the man who bought it painted over the words, "Family Owned," since 1986 the same week. 14 months from the day Reuben Ortiz opened that folder, Royce Kestler was charged. Insurance fraud. Falsification of state records. Grand theft. 11 counts, 1 for every motorcycle, and every count carried a name. He is not in his commercials anymore. Nobody has painted his name on the side of a building in 4 years. And nobody laid a hand on him. Not one. 17 men who could have ended Royce Kestler in an afternoon walked into a newspaper office instead and handed a reporter a folder that a fired kid had kept in a bedroom drawer. That's the whole story of what happened to Royce Kestler. He was undone by paperwork. Royce Kestler had 4 dealerships and 140 employees, and he lost every single one of them because a 23-year-old kid kept a folder, and a mechanic nobody had ever heard of refused to look away. That is how it actually works, not with fists, with quiet people doing the right thing over and over until the right thing gets too heavy for men like Kestler to hold up anymore. So if you have someone in your life who does the quiet right thing, and you know if you do, share this with them right now and comment for the quiet ones, because the vultures never share anything. They only take. There is still a road in Ashland Ridge, Ohio, that used to be somebody's shortcut and isn't anymore. The weeds still come up through the seams. The bypass is still 4 miles east, and it is never going anywhere. And there is still a 2-bay garage on it, with a hand-painted sign out front that says Boone's. Nothing else. No phone number, no hours. It's open. Walter Boone did not lose that building. He walked into the bank 3 days after the road was blocked at both ends, and he set $14,000 on a desk in front of a woman who had sent him 6 letters, and he did not explain where it came from, and she did not ask, and the file was closed that afternoon. He has not been behind a payment since. There is a waiting list now. That's the strangest part, and Walter will tell you so himself, with a look on his face like the whole thing is a joke somebody is playing on him. Word went out about a garage in Ashland Ridge, and word does not come back. Men ride 4 and 5 hours to leave a motorcycle in that lot. There are bikes in there right now from Pennsylvania, from Michigan, from Kentucky. He does not advertise. He has never had a website. He does not know how one would work. He still isn't fast. He still isn't cheap. He's just good. And he is not alone in there anymore. Reuben Ortiz has worked at Boone's garage for 4 years. He started about 2 months after the folder went to the reporter, walked in the door with no job, no references, and a reputation in 3 counties that had been assassinated by a man in a television commercial, and Walter Boone put a wrench in his hand and told him to get to work. He's 27 now. He is not a tow driver, he is a mechanic, and by every account he is going to be a very good one. And there is an old man teaching him the trade the way an old man taught it to a boy, standing on an upturned crate in that exact building in 1966. Reuben's mother's rent is not a problem anymore. He doesn't talk about the folder. Somebody asks him about it a couple times a year, and he changes the subject. The ring came back. 19 charters, 4 states, and a pawn shop on 4th Street in Mansfield that had a small women's wedding band in a case for 11 days before somebody found it. They bought it back. They would not tell Walter what they paid, and they would not take money for it. And there was a very brief, very quiet argument in that garage that Walter Boone lost. It sits on the register, right next to a pair of wire-frame reading glasses, with one arm slightly bent from being sat on, a long time ago, by somebody who thought it was funnier than her husband did. He has never put it back on. Somebody asked him about that once, and he said he didn't need to. He said he knows exactly where it is. Elias Vance wrote again. It took a long time. There were 4 months of learning to stand, and then to walk, and then to hold his own weight. And there was a spring morning about 7 months after Route 32, when a 69-year-old man got on a 1998 Softail in a gravel lot in Ashland Ridge, with about a dozen people standing there not saying anything. He rode it once, down to the end of the road and back, slowly, maybe 25 miles an hour, and then he came back, and shut it off, and sat there, and then he got off, and put the key on the bench, and told Walter Boone the bike was his. Walter refused. Immediately. Flatly. Kept refusing, for about 20 minutes, and Deacon Vance let him say all of it, and then he said the only thing he said about it that day, a thing belongs to whoever loved it enough to bring it back, and then he got in a truck and went home. He left it in the lot. It is still there. It has not been ridden since, not once, by anybody. It sits under a cover at the north end of the building, and Walter Boone starts it once a month, and lets it run for 10 minutes and then shuts it off, and that is all. He never repainted the tank. He could have. It would have been easy. He had the color. He had the clear. He could have buried those letters again, the way Elias Vance buried them in 1998, and no one would ever have said a word about it. He left them showing, hand-lettered, leaning slightly to the right, in the crooked hand of a man who was not steady the week his daughter came home from the hospital. And when somebody comes into that garage and stands in front of that bike and asks about it, and they do, several times a week, Walter Boone puts down whatever he's holding, and he walks over, and he pulls back the cover, and he tells them her name. There's a sign above the door at Boone's garage now. Reuben Ortiz hung it the day he started, and Walter Boone did not ask him to, and has never taken it down. It isn't a slogan. It isn't for customers. It's just 11 words that a hard man said to his son a long time ago, into an engine block, in a shop on a road that used to have traffic. You don't fix a machine. You fix whatever it was carrying. Walter Boone fixed a motorcycle for free, and 147 men he had never met decided that meant something. Before you go, Royce Kestler is a free man in some version of this world. Men like him always are. There's another one right now, in another county, holding another contract, waiting for another family to be too broken to make a phone call. They count on your silence. That's the whole business. So don't be silent. If Walter Boone earned 4 minutes of your attention, if a 23-year-old kid who lost everything for doing the right thing earned it, then leave one thing behind before you close this. Comment, say her name. For a girl born in 1998, whose father wrote her name on a gas tank and never told a soul, and who is still on that tank today because a stranger refused to paint over her. And subscribe. Not for me. Because on this channel, we tell the stories the vultures would rather you never heard. About the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, and the men in leather that this country spent 60 years teaching you to fear. They passed a hat for a man they'd never met. What are you going to pass on?